All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the third part of a webinar series entitled Keep Oakland Schools Segregated? And I'm really excited to have the conversation today. My name's Jeremy Gormley. I'm the founder of Integrate Oakland Schools. Also really coming to today's conversation with a heavy heart because our co-producer Dirk Tillotson was sadly killed a couple weeks ago and can't be here with us today. And we put a lot of effort into trying to put these webinars together, and his voice will certainly be missed. I'm hoping we can honor him in today's conversation, and I definitely want to provide the space as our panelists are introducing themselves. If there are any stories that you want to quickly share about Dirk, please feel free to do that. I'll just say really quickly, Dirk was so welcoming to me when I entered the education space in Oakland. As I think everyone knows, it can be difficult at times to get plugged in and overcome a level of distrust that I don't think is a secret that exists. But he was incredibly helpful to me as I was kind of figuring out how to plug in here. So yeah, we will definitely miss him, and we'll try to channel him as we have our conversation today. So with that, Reed, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for that, Jeremy. My name is Reed Levitt, and I am a recent Master of Public Policy graduate from UC Berkeley's Goldman School of Public Policy. Prior to that, I was a high school English teacher and restorative justice practitioner here in the East Bay in Richmond. And my master's capstone and my master's degree in general really focused on desegregation, and particularly desegregation in Oakland. And so I'm very grateful and honored to be part of today's conversation. And I wanted to just echo your sentiments about how welcoming and warm Dirk was, and also echo the condolences that you shared for especially his family and his friends, and for everybody who he cared about and who cared about him, which means like a large percentage of Oakland. So I hope that we can make him proud, even though we cannot obviously replace him. So yes, and with that, I'll pass it on to Cassie.
Yeah, I'm also excited to be part of this conversation and thinking of Dirk. It was actually the initial webinar in this series is how Dirk and I first connected and started working after years of reading great school voices. I'd reached out and was like, I need to learn from you, and I want to be part of the work that you're doing. So it feels really meaningful to get to be part of this, and to get to be one of a lot of people who are carrying forward kind of the work he does. Should I also do an introduction?
Yeah. Feel free to introduce yourself, Cassie.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess I should. I'm Cassie Parham. I am a founding co-director of the Oakland Literacy Coalition. So we are behind a citywide effort to address the fact that in Oakland, only 1 in 3 students are reading at grade level. And that the issue of literacy for me is really inextricable from the conversation we're having today about racial equity in our schools. We are a city where, a white kid in the hills is 5 times more likely to be reading proficiently than a Black kid in the heart of Oakland. And that's not new. It's been that way for generations. It's not certainly unique to Oakland, but it's also not by accident. I think when we have a system that continuously over generations produces racist and inequitable outcomes, like that's not a design bug, that's a design feature. And so I'm coming into this conversation with just the question of how can desegregation and enrollment policy be one of the many strategies that we need in place and can it be an effective and feasible way of doing that, to actually redesign equity in our school system. And I'm also a parent, so I have a second grader at Laurel Elementary School, which I love. It's our neighborhood school. I have a 4-year-old who will be starting kindergarten there next fall. And I think, Laurel's kind of an interesting case to kind of look at as part of this conversation because it's actually in an integrated neighborhood. It's Lower Hills, so, the sort of legacy of restricted covenants and redlining kind of in the hills combined with more recent gentrification means it's actually like very integrated across race and class. And yet that's not actually reflected in the school, which is like beautifully diverse, but is 80% low income and I think 3% white. So, that unlike, maybe our hills or our flats where the broader kind of neighborhood segregation and who has social and economic mobility to choose where they live and thereby kind of choose into their schools. Like Laurel is a neighborhood where the segregation of the school is actually in part driven by, white and or privileged families sort of actively opting out. And so I guess it like really illustrates for me that I think one of the trickiest parts of this conversation that I'm going to have is it's going to, for desegregation to work, it's going to require that the people with the most power and privilege currently in the system are going to have to be willing to actually change how we approach and experience school choice. And we've not yet seen that happen in a, significant way. So I'll stop there. Brian.
Good morning. Yes, good afternoon. Sorry, everyone. Brian Stanley, former ED of the Oakland Ed Fund, graduated from Oakland schools, went to Oakland High, greatest high school in the history of Oakland. Go Wildcats, rawr. Make the same joke everywhere. I've made the same joke for 20 years. So if you heard it before, you're right. I have a fifth grader who goes to Sankofa United, which was he was formerly at Kaiser, and then moved down excitedly to join that new enterprise. And then I have an older child who graduated from Kaiser, now goes to East Bay School for Boys in Berkeley. I think I'm always curious with these questions of how do you improve the quality school experience, particularly for kids that look like mine. I'm always curious about how you actually convert the rhetoric to reality. Because when the rubber meets the road, these are families making choices, and I both firmly believe that every system is exquisitely designed to get the results it produces. And so if you don't like the results, but you're not willing to attack and improve and reimagine the design, then you're likely simply going to continue to run into the same problems. And I also think it's really easy for people to say the right thing and do the same thing. So I'm very curious to sort of have this conversation and figure out maybe there are some things that we can do a little different. And then on Dirk, as a good brother. I met Dirk when I was running the Ed Fund. He would come to all our events, and he would always both encourage me, even when moments when I was particularly frustrated with the district or with the system in some way. And Dirk, and I said this at one of the many remembrances of him in the community, but I think the thing that always stands out to me is he was a bit of a dream holder. And he believed in Oakland, and he believed in the people, the adults. The kid believing in the kids is never the question, right? It's the adults, and he believes in the adults far longer and harder and deeper than we probably believed in ourselves. I often thought of him as someone who, if you came to him and said, "This is really hard, I don't know how we're going to solve this," and he would say, "Yes, it's really hard. And here is the history of the struggle. But now you are here, good brother or sister, and you are who we've been waiting for." You're like, okay, Dirk, okay, I'll do it. So those people are few and far between in our world. And he is both deeply and sorely missed, and deepest condolences to everyone who grieves and will continue to grieve his loss. And I firmly pray that his memory continue to be a blessing to those who knew him and those who will only know him through his works.
Yeah, appreciate all of that, and thank you, each of you for being here again today. So just to frame our conversation, the goal today is to continue the discussions that we had in the first two parts of this series, but try today to focus on what might be some specific policy solutions that could reduce, not necessarily eliminate, but reduce school segregation district-wide. And I certainly want to recognize that there is more to this conversation when we're talking about racial equity in schools than student assignment policy. But I'm going to steal a quote that Reed mentioned to me, is that I believe desegregation is a necessary but insufficient part of school equity. And also, I think we'll come back to this, and I think, Cassie, some of your points will also come up again, that we are going to largely be talking today about desegregation policy. The idea that we are trying to get a certain balance of students in schools in order to reduce racial inequities, but that does not guarantee integrated environments. That does not guarantee that students will be welcomed in buildings, that will have a curriculum that's affirming for everyone, that will have adequate teacher representation, whatever it may be, to really make sure that we have a thriving community. We try to address that, I think, a little bit in our second part, and we can certainly, anyone should feel free to incorporate that in today's discussion. But I want to recognize up front that when we are talking about policy solutions at this level, at the enrollment policy level or student assignment policy, we don't really get to address how to make sure that those environments, once the school composition is in a way that's reducing segregation, it's fostering an environment where everyone can be successful. So I don't know if anyone wanted to add to that, but I would like to just restate the problem that I believe we are addressing, and folks should feel free to weigh in if they feel like there's something missing from that. But just to set us up, especially if you weren't able to tune into the first couple. So one of the key issues that I've identified through research that is not necessarily my own, but tried to apply to Oakland's context, but there is a lot of research that shows segregating students by race and class perpetuates racial equities in learning outcomes. There's a number of ways we could look at this. There's a number of ways we could define school segregation. I continue to come back to research out of Stanford that I'm just going to highlight here for a minute. We did focus on this a little bit in the first webinar, but this research really shows that the greater the difference in school poverty between the average white student school and the average Black student school, the greater likelihood that a school district will fail to close racial achievement gaps. And this is on the macro level. This is not saying that no school will be an exception to this, but there is a strong association that a school will not overcome racial disparities if a high level of segregation exists. And in Oakland, the average white student school is about 40% low income compared to the average Black student school, which is around 73% low income, leaving about a 30% gap in the average white and Black student schools. And that's actually, according to research I've done, that's actually worse when you look at Latino students. It's closer to 40%. And we can see here, this graph actually highlights the top 100 largest school districts. And Oakland ranks about 14th when it comes to those that have the worst levels of school segregation. And that's actually very similar to its level at the neighborhood as well. Just want to pause there and see if anyone else wants to weigh in and see if this if this resonates or if there's stories that are perhaps missing from research like this.
I can jump in just to echo, I think what, this graph in particular really demonstrates is that it's not actually about Black and brown schools having more white kids in them, right? Like, it's not proximity to whiteness that's the silver bullet of this. And in fact, we know that lots of times when white families go into majority Black and brown schools, they actually can cause quite a bit of harm. We've listened to the Nice White Parents podcast and things like that and seen it happen repeatedly. It's about resources. So I think being able to draw that connection between whiteness and resources, and then the resource gap between what that happens when we see segregated schools, that's where the issue and where the opportunity, I think, really lies.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily what this graph shows is it's not harmful concentrating different races in different schools, because minority students, students of color, are more likely to be low income. The fact that we concentrate students by race in schools, that in effect creates high poverty and low poverty schools. And to be general about it, higher poverty schools are more likely to be less effective for various reasons, whether it's higher teacher turnover, less experienced teachers, strain on resources because there is a higher need to address those conditions associated with living in poverty. So this research, I think, does bear that out, that those gaps along racial lines exist because of the poverty.
And I think, Brian, to bring in kind of what you were talking about in our kind of initial emails, it has to be a both and, I think, right? Because we know, given the demographics of Oakland, we are, even if we're able to desegregate, we're still going to have schools that are majority low income or majority Black and brown. And frankly, I think that we need to both say, how are we making sure that kids in the flatlands right now are able to get an excellent education given their current demographics? Mm-hmm. And how do we create a system where we don't have these hyper concentrated pockets of disproportionate wealth and privilege and resources, which compound, obviously, that inequity.
Yeah, I mean, I think you really do have to think very carefully about, as you're be very clear about the problems you're trying to solve, and make sure that you're not creating other problems or that you're setting up things that are unattainable. So it is, people buy houses based upon the schools they're at. I remember a couple years ago when Crocker was sort of bursting at the gills with kids. There was this I went to one of the PTA meetings or something, and parents were like, well, it's not guaranteed that my kid will go to the school because I bought a house specifically to get to the school, because that's the only way I could do that. I imagine probably Oakland Tech probably has very similar issues where parents are like, wait, I live in the zone. It's like, yeah, but you have to be touching the grounds in order to get into the school because it's so full, right? So yeah, there's definitely a real and perceived issue with the perception of some school, and that drives very expensive, complicated family decisions with real impacts, right? If the choice between buying a house in near School A adds another $500,000 to your housing costs versus School B where it doesn't, that's a fairly consequential choice from all families that I'm aware of. So anyway.
No, I appreciate that. So that's one thing to definitely pay attention to as we eventually get into the solutions. And Reed, you want to walk us through kind of the second part of this that I see as a little bit more on the micro level as we think about kind of differentiating this problem statement from what I just addressed?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think what Brian just said speaks to this a lot, the perception gaps of quality between and among schools, and the way that they can then contribute to, yes, like Brian, you mentioned, the way that families with the money to make choices of where they live will spend a lot more money to live in a highly sought after brand name school enrollment district or enrollment attendance area. And this just leads to enrollment inequities along race and class lines. You can go to the next slide, please, Jeremy. You can see from this analysis that actually Jeremy conducted using OUSD data, the percentage of students from an attendance area who opt out of their neighborhood school, whether this means they're going to another district choice school or whether they're going to a charter school, private school, or out of district, the greater the percentage of Black or Latinx students in the student body, the higher the opt-out rate is. And it's, as you can see, a fairly linear model. And the same thing holds true for percentage much. So as one of the many issues with highly concentrated poverty, which I'm really appreciative of folks pointing out that it's not white kids that Black and Latinx kids need in order to thrive in school. It's resources and highly qualified teachers and experienced teachers and stable learning environments that resources can provide. As you can see, when a school has a high, in Oakland at least, when schools have a high percentage of Black and Latinx students, they also then have a lower enrollment, which makes it that much more difficult to deliver the resources necessary for a great education.
And I think I just, add it about 66% of students are opting out of their neighborhood school in Oakland. It does vary quite a bit by region. It varies by a student's race, but it certainly, I think, begs the question of what are we doing between the connection between our neighborhood, our local school, and our ideas of what choice means, because while we have perhaps high opt-out rates, it doesn't mean necessarily that students are still getting in where they want to. And that also, going back to Brian's point, depends on where we might live. So there's this perception of choice, and we're going to kind of address that a little bit in some of the policy solutions that might not necessarily be realized or achieved for a large segment of Oakland students. Cassie or Brian, any reactions that you wanted to add before we move on from this?
No.
All right.
I'm good.
So one other thing that I think is worth highlighting, and I'd be curious to get folks' thoughts on this, is that one reaction to whether or not enrollment policy is or should be a solution to addressing school segregation is, well, our neighborhoods are segregated. That's really an intractable problem. Why should we try to do this through student assignment? Let's either wait until neighborhoods become less segregated, or throw up our hands and realize it's too big of a problem to address. Just to put some numbers behind it, using certain metrics of segregation, about 60% of elementary school students would have to move around at the neighborhood level if we wanted to achieve a balance where every neighborhood was representative of the district as a whole. Contrast that to the school level, where about 70% of students would have to move around, meaning that we are actually, through our enrollment policy, making segregation worse than if everyone just went to their local neighborhood school. What I would add to that, though, is I wouldn't say that even if we weren't making it worse, it's not a reason to do nothing, because in many ways, student assignment policy is not as difficult to implement, although obviously it creates a great deal of political will. or requires a great deal of political will. But it is far easier to create more desegregated schools than it would be at the neighborhood level.
So let me make sure I would understand this. So the current enrollment policy, which privileges neighborhood, I think sibling neighborhood, I don't remember the hierarchy, forgive, is making it about 10% worse, but fixing it, if we try to do something just in the neighborhood level, would require moving 3 out of 5 elementary school kids in the city to a new school.
Right. So imagine everyone just went to a school in their attendance area. We would have a level of segregation where, if we wanted to achieve some balance, 60% of kids would have to move schools. So we're operating at a pretty high level of segregation to begin with if everyone just went to their local school, which shows us how segregated our neighborhood is, which I think is a surprise to many. But then when we go look at the schools, we look at the actual students in the schools, and this is from, I think, 2019, 2020. If we wanted to say, I want the same balance, 70% of kids would now have to move schools. Okay. So we're actually creating an additional burden, or you could say, okay, we have an open enrollment system where kids have a lot of choice to move around, so we must be disrupting segregation at some level. No, we're actually adding to the problem.
Got it. Okay.
I wonder about, as we talked about kind of the difference between full integration, right, and desegregation, like how that comes into play with this slide, because we're talking here about having schools that are actually integrated, like that are representative of our city's demographics. And so that's going to take a enormously, I think, larger lift than if we're talking instead about desegregating. And especially, I mean, what we're really talking about is desegregating our schools of concentrated privilege and power and whiteness and resources, right? And so, like, I'm curious about what that would actually look like if we were talking instead about having those schools that are on the hyper segregated, that side of it. Like, if you had those schools look integrated, and instead it wasn't asking for every school in the city. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because I think that's like ultimately the, this kind of gets back to that, like, both and, like, we need schools that are not integrated and serving and have high poverty to be serving our kids well. And we shouldn't compound it by having hyper privilege and power in those, a small subset of our schools.
I want to give other folks an opportunity to respond too. And also say, if folks watching, feel free to add comments to this discussion. And we'll try to either answer them in real time or at the end. But I agree, Cassie. I think there is a spectrum, and there are extremes on each end that we could bring in closer, so that we are not creating such disparities among wealth or poverty within schools, because I do think that's where we probably see the largest resource gaps. And so I go back to, I do try to think of this on the district-wide level. We know there are exceptions to most of the things that we're bringing up here, but if we want to think about how can we benefit the most schools, yes, I guess that's one framing, is that we have schools that are, a large number of schools that are 90% FRL, free or reduced price lunch, and then we have schools that are 12% in a district that's around 70%. How is that happening? How can we create policies that might prevent that from happening?
I wanted to chime in because I agree. At least the affluent, segregated, largely white schools in the hills and North Oakland that have like 12% free and reduced lunch. That to me feels absolutely inequitable, unethical, and unacceptable. And I'm also really kind of thinking about the equity implications of focusing narrowly just on those schools and in a sense redoing the old school style of desegregation of asking low-income students of color to, in some cases, get on a bus and travel and take on that burden of travel and of leaving the neighborhood and of leaving even just proximity to the comfort of one's own home in order to get a good education without equally asking affluent white families to shoulder their share, which at this time in history might actually, one could argue that affluent white families ought to shoulder a larger burden and do more of the traveling down the hill as opposed to the crops. I think it's interesting to kind of think about how do you break up those highly concentrated affluent schools without reinscribing some kind of dangerous perceptions in reality.
So, oh, go ahead, Kathy.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think that is why we have to be so careful, and also why I think like it's really important as we get into discussions about like making policy decisions. Like it has to be the voices of the families who've been most disadvantaged and most harmed by the system, who are leading the way and whose kind of needs and priorities are centered in it, right? Because exactly, I mean, we've seen every time we've made any efforts to desegregate or increase racial equity, the burden is felt entirely by the people who are already most harmed by it. And there's a real danger, I think, of replicating that. And so, yeah, I think that is like I'm not a policy expert. I don't know that I'll have like a lot of, insight about the technical aspects, but I think that is the thing that is like almost most important to pay attention to, and the trickiest, like the hardest part of this, because that's where it takes the civic and political will and the willingness of people who have power and advantage in the system to say, like, how am I willing to give that up? And historically, we've not seen people say yes to that. I hold out hope, given the number of Black Lives Matter signs I see driving around my neighborhood, that people actually may not make the connection always. But that's where that's where the rubber hits the road, I think.
Yeah, I think the opposition also gets a vote. So I think when we've seen this tried in the past in Oakland, what we saw were people leaving, right? And then certainly in the early in the 80s and 90s, the district tried any number of things to get those families back. And once they're gone, they're gone. Like, this isn't like people generally don't come back, barring a fairly significant change in their primarily financial circumstances, right? So I think if the notion is that families who are affluent and are going to schools that reflect their values will not easily give up those benefits, even if the reason for giving them up is right and just and moral, right? There is an enormous difficulty there, and oftentimes in the history of OUSD, the system has struggled to deliver on that, just because it's hard. It's like 6-dimensional chess. It's just hard, and sometimes I think it can be, sometimes we'll just do it because it's right, and it's like, yeah, not so much, because oftentimes that then ends up with consequences that still bake in the bias and still bake in all of the things that we're trying to specifically avoid. So when Oakland tried magnet programs, they told the schools in the northwest part of the city, spend what you want. It's wonderful. Go get them, Tiger. And they told schools in the west and east and central parts of the city, you must spend within your budgets. You cannot spend any additional money, right? Small shift, but that's material, right? So you can create robust arts programs and go over budget, district could back you up, but you have to make that fit in schools that are larger and with more challenges. You have to make that fit within budgets that might already feel quite tight. So that's just one example. So anyway, all that to say, man, that's hard. That's hard.
Yeah, and I do think there's a conversation to be had around how comfortable are we with if folks do leave because a policy is going to disrupt their expectations or certain advantages that they've had. I think we'll get to this in a little bit, but when Berkeley changed their model in the 60s, they did have a significant number of families leave, and they gradually came back. I do also think that, what is it that's currently forcing so many families out of the system, and how can we also think about a policy drawing some of them back, because we offer more predictability, or we are finally perhaps living our values through policy, or are putting forth values because we haven't even considered them before. So I certainly think it's easier said, as you said, Brian, but there's something to consider. Which do we value more, and can we figure out what our tolerance for a loss of enrollment might be, and what else is that going to require, so that we put something in place now, and we're not having the same conversation in 5 years. Reid, do you want to tee us up for how we might look at different policies?
In one moment, I was wondering if we could, Sarah Wheeler asked a really good question in that, which we've been touching on, but I think it might be worth facing head on, which is, do we have any thoughts or counter arguments to the fear that if we had systematic desegregation policies, even more affluent or white families would leave OUSD? I'd love to start, which is so many affluent and white families have already left OUSD. It's a vanishingly small percentage of the overall OUSD enrollment. And from my perspective, and from some research that I've done, which included interviews with families from across the racial, geographic, and socioeconomic spectrum in Oakland, there's a real sense that white families are privileged at every turn in the enrollment policy, by the way that not only neighborhood preference is sacrosanct and supersedes everything. So if you have the money, like Brian mentioned, to buy into a highly sought after attendance area, you're golden. But even for those affluent white families who are living in maybe gentrifying areas, or who are gentrifiers in a low income neighborhood, they also, because there's no expectation or there's no requirement to attend your neighborhood school, they also can enter into the open enrollment process. And because they tend to have more resources in terms of time to visit schools, time to be part of online parent networks, time to drive their kids maybe across the city to a school that they want to go to that's hard to access by public transit, they also can get into one of these highly sought after, high white percentage, low free and reduced lunch percentage schools. And so the system has, like you were mentioning, Brian, tried to lure affluent white families back to the district with very little success. And so from my perspective, that ship has already sailed, and there's no need to be afraid of white families and white flight anymore. And instead, let's focus on who's in the district. And I think invite affluent white families, as every family is in Oakland is invited to be part of the school system, but don't be afraid, because I think that if you look at the dropping enrollment in OUSD, I don't have the numbers, unfortunately, but it's my expectation that enrollment at this time, you're losing a lot more Black and Latinx students to charter schools than you are affluent white families to other districts or private schools.
It also just seems like if we are trying to build, design racial equity into a system and do it thinking about how, the needs and wants of white and privileged families, and with a frame of like fear of what they're going to do, or frankly, like their ability to kind of hold the system hostage. Like I don't think that leads us to make decisions that are ultimately going to line up with the goal that we've set out for the process.
So I think I just pulled up the little chart so I could look at it. So actually, from 2000 to today, to 2021, white student enrollment on USD has gone up to about 5,000, from starting about 3,000. It used to be much higher if you look at the data from the 60s, 70s, but that was different Oakland. So I think where I would agree with Reed is that the people you're losing are families like mine, right? Black middle class families who have options and may not necessarily feel that may have difficulty saying, I'm going to go ahead and put my child in the system that I know from my own experience is going to struggle to meet the needs of my child, but do it because there's some deeper social commitment. I think there's a real tension there. I think if you, and I don't think that that has never been a part of the conversation. I see my good friend Kim Davis. What's up, Kim? Saying, right, that to me, the question really is, I don't care what school you go to. What does it take to ensure that when you go to that school, you get what you need? And that, I think, continues to be the underlying thing that is the struggler. People talk a lot about Berkeley. I think one of the really interesting things about Berkeley has managed to convince everyone that all the schools are more or less the same. That is a very, 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 very difficult bar in Oakland. It just is. It's a much bigger system. It's a much bigger system. It is many more different types of neighborhoods. There are some parts of Oakland where I would not, if my child to go to that school, I would not send my child to that school. If it was like you're forced, then we're going to have to do something different. There are other neighborhoods where I have no problem. And that's just real. And there's history and there's all this stuff that really weighs in there. I think much differently than Berkeley, because Berkeley started this, in the 60s? And it's 2021, almost 22 in Oakland. So they've had quite a head start to trying to have some of these conversations and reframe these things. And they've made different investments and all that. So I do think, and so I guess our last point, OUSD can't afford to lose any more kids. White, Black, Latino, it doesn't really matter. At this point, our infrastructure is so overbuilt for the number of students that we have. I think one time, I think I said this before, I looked, when OUC's enrollment was 60,000 kids in ye olden days, we have enough facilities to essentially support about that many kids now. We cannot do that. There aren't 60,000 school-age children who would come to OUSD, even if you deleted all the charters and all of it. So you really do have a problem of an overbuilt system that has been unable to reconcile with the way that California does its financing and funding. And if we don't like it, then we can change it. But until we do, we are hamstrung essentially by the fact that we are funded per kid. And so super small schools, too many school staff really limit your ability to make the types of investments in instruction and learning and development that parents are looking for, right? So most of the time when California does an increase in school funding, most of that money just simply goes to pay the staff who are already there a little bit more according to contract. That's not a knock. That's just an economic reality. And so you have to Oakland has to really make some fairly difficult financial choices that are contested and vehemently opposed and incredibly complicated. And until you do, then you won't really be able to make the investments in the consistent quality experience for kids and families that I think we all know we need. but we've really been unable to deliver across all 78 square miles and 84, whatever the number is now, schools in Oakland. And until we do that, you're going to keep losing folks. You're going to keep losing folks.
I'll offer a quick response, and then let's get into our criteria so we can just highlight a few ideas, and if folks are okay, we might go a few minutes over. I do think that this conversation can't be had in a void, and if the idea, if we are afraid of losing families because of certain enrollment policies, then yeah, it pushes the conversation around facilities and perhaps too many seats to the front, and then forces us to make some of those hard decisions. It's obviously simplistic to say let's make sure it's clear that, okay, if we have an enrollment policy and we predict to lose X% of families, then we might have to close a school or two. But the idea, and to Kim's point, and Sarah echoed this, is that I do see desegregating schools as a way to get to more quality schools, to keep more families in the district, to bring more families into the district, to keep some of those middle income families who realize that the system is broken. If I don't get into the school where I want, then I don't know where I get in or where I live as bad options. So just wanted to throw that out there. But Reed, you want to highlight some of the ways we're thinking about policy alternatives?
Yeah, thank you. And so these are just the criteria that we're gonna evaluate both the status quo policy and a couple possible directions that OUSD enrollment policy might go in the future. These categories are not they're not comprehensive. For instance,
this is very sophisticated analysis presenting.
You can see, right? No, this is a very non-comprehensive kind of bite-sized, digestible criteria of evaluation framework. It's not a starting point, and it's not meant to be the final word. Although we have based our evaluation on evidence from OUSD and other districts, OUSD survey data, statistical analysis when possible. Ultimately, though, the point of this conversation is to just sort of compare and contrast on these very limited lines the several options that OUSD has. There are other options that are not included here, but these are ones that we thought could be particularly impactful. We looked at them. I think you'll appreciate, Brian, with an eye towards feasibility, because as you rightly pointed out, an awesome idea on paper is not always awesome when the rubber hits the road, if it's become so hackneyed or convoluted by the time it reaches the real world that it's no longer achieving its goals. So we tried to look at that. We know that choice is a really important value for families, but we really want to focus on equitable choice. The current system obviously offers a high level of choice, but without transportation options, it really privileges those families who have flexible work schedules and access to a car or access to strong public transportation networks. And so we really want equitable choice, particularly for Black and Brown families, to be able to choose schools. And then because as you point out, Kim, and as Jeremy said, we see integrated schools or desegregated schools as one of the ways to stem the tide of decreasing enrollment in high poverty schools, to increase resources to those schools and therefore increase quality in those schools. We really focus on the effects of how much desegregation do we expect each of these policies to have. Again, this is just a starting point, and the hope is that Oakland Unified and the school board actually engages in a more thorough policy process that, as Cassie pointed out, hopefully includes a very strong and really intentionally equitable community engagement piece to make sure that the plan is responsive to all Oaklanders, and particularly those most affected by school inequities.
So just to quickly kind of give us a baseline, and then we're going to look at a couple alternatives. if we were to apply this methodology to the status quo, and here's, I'd love to see if folks agree or disagree. The status quo is right now, you have an option for just thinking about an average school. Not all schools give you this option. But if I want to apply to a school in Oakland, I have some preferences. Those often include where I live. I might be able to go to my local neighborhood school. If I'm not interested in that school and want to go elsewhere, I could enter a lottery, and my chances would probably be similar to other folks applying to said school outside of that neighborhood as well. As we already showed, we kind of consider the status quo to be pretty bad when it comes to levels of segregation. So from a desegregation standpoint, it's doing a bad job. We think equitable choice is okay. You do have an option to apply and be considered in a lot of schools. But if we think about, what, quote unquote, high demand schools, not necessarily a term that everyone favors, but look at the most like high demand schools at the elementary level, for instance. Those are schools that are traditionally pretty high income, above average white levels. About 8% of students are getting into those schools if they don't live in the neighborhood of those students. Now that's not really equitable choice. That's kind of concentration of privilege. So we don't really see the status quo being pretty high on that. And feasibility, obviously, we could just keep what we have, and that would be really easy to do. So pretty high marks on the feasibility scale. This is not an uncommon system by any means. We do see very similar systems in a number of cities that give neighborhood preference, but also have some sort of lottery where you can apply elsewhere. But a lot of those cities also have pretty high levels of segregation and quite big disparity when it comes to quality and stable enrollment. Although Oakland, as we saw before, ranks pretty poorly on both measures. So that's where we're starting from. Kind of pretty bad levels when it comes to segregation. So on choice, at least in our view. But obviously, it'd be really easy to just keep what we have. So here's one alternative. Reed, did you want to highlight how this one, or should I keep going?
You can go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. So one alternative, and this is similar to where Oakland's actually headed, is trying to prioritize those students who have been historically disadvantaged when it comes to operating within student assignment. That might be in the lottery, prioritizing either after neighborhood preference, before neighborhood preference. Obviously, those will have different impacts. Students who live in low-income neighborhoods who are opting out of a neighborhood school to begin with, and we want to give them some preference when they're looking at schools where they've traditionally not had as high a chance of getting into. There's different ways to implement something like this. As I said before, it might be a change in priority, or you could set aside a percentage of seats for those students. Or you could say, I'm only going to allow 80% of kids from the neighborhood into the school, and the other 20% are going to be prioritized for those low-income students outside of the neighborhood. This is something that's being implemented in more and more places. Sometimes it's only at high-demand schools because it would be hard to implement this at a school that isn't generating as much interest because it wouldn't have as much of an impact. But the moving the needle from an equity lens is obviously going to be limited with this suggestion regardless, because it does assume that you have enough interest at schools to be able to set aside seats. If you don't have interest in a school, you're not drawing kids to begin with, setting aside seats, changing priorities is not going to make a huge difference. So that's why we say that something like this, so something like expanding the enrollment pilots that Oakland has done already at a couple schools is probably pretty limited when it comes to segregation, because how do we draw students to those schools that don't have the level of demand to begin with? We can't necessarily set aside seats. Perhaps we can do it at schools that might be experiencing what we call tipping, meaning that they're becoming more affluent, they're becoming more white, and we want to make sure students who have traditionally been served by those schools are guaranteed a seat, even if they don't live in the neighborhood. But it does, I think, improve choice. It allows more students to get into schools that are considered high demand. And because Oakland has implemented already a few pilots along these lines, I think the feasibility for this is pretty decent. Cassie or Brian, I'd be curious to get your sense around something like this, and Brian, especially since a school like Sankofa, I could definitely see being part of the conversation around being part of a future pilot. And as I said, I think the scale for implementing this is limited, but it certainly has potential.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's plenty of room in Sankofa United right now. So if anyone who's listening, please feel free to select that school in your options process. Yeah, I would say my wondering there would be it'd be interesting to understand a bit more about the students and families that are able to make that choice versus those that can't. What I often worry about, or what I tend to think of as schools of the left behind, the students the families that couldn't or wouldn't take an opportunity to exit for many perfectly legitimate, understandable reasons, right? They're their reasons. But then what happens to those schools? And does that continue to put pressure on those schools such that eventually you get a Lafayette scenario where you end up having to close the school because there's just too few kids that actually are choosing that school, and keeping it open is very difficult to have make economic sense.
I think, not a flip necessarily of that, but a juxtaposition is, this concept of equitable choice. And I think that's such an important element to include in this. And what I appreciate about this model is it actually doesn't, like, the choice is perhaps limited for the people who are advantaged by the system, right? It's actually not limiting the choices of low-income students or low-income families. It increases it, as opposed to some of the other models, which, if it is more restrictive in creating more limited choices for all families in varying degrees, like it doesn't have that same kind of equitable choice. And I think, Brian, you're speaking to, there can be a negative consequence of that. That can result in continued pressure on those left behind schools. But I do think, given the reality of where we're at right now, maintaining equitable choice for Black and brown families is super important in this. So I think that's a really important element of this particular option.
Yeah, absolutely. And those are, I think, Brian highlighted some very real concerns. This is also a policy idea that still, I think, puts a burden on families of color more. And it doesn't provide logical alternatives to families that have this expectation. I've been expecting a seat here, and now it might be taken away. What do I do? And there isn't a clear answer to that. And I do think that's problematic. But to your point, Cassie, it is recognizing that certain groups, predominantly white affluent families, have been given more choice in the past, and so it's controlling some of that without taking away from families historically underserved. Great. We are going to go a few minutes over if folks are okay with that. But we're going to highlight one other policy alternative. And Reed, you want to go ahead and do that?
Yeah. So this policy alternative, I think, does address what you were talking about, Brian, that sort of what about kids who are left behind, and that sort of one-way nature of the previous plan. This is a kind of multi-school regions or zones. And what it would do is it would split Oakland into diverse attendance zones.
It's 13 hours.
With a preference for, you no longer have priority just for your one neighborhood school, but instead you get to select among your attendance areas schools, which could be 3, 5, 10. The minutiae of the policy are less important than the main idea. And then you would use not just family preference, but also district diversity or desegregation goals and balance those two. And so it balances both family choice and the district. It also would increase predictability when your first option is unavailable. Right now in Oakland, if you don't like your neighborhood school, then you are able to enter the lottery of any of those 78 schools or whatever the number is. And there's no real telling where you'll get assigned. This would, you would not be guaranteed a seat in any particular school, but you would at least know the kind of option set that you're choosing between or among. And then also it would make it so that there's kind of more of a connection between where you live and where you go to school, even though you wouldn't necessarily go to the school that you're most close to. You would also, there would be somewhat of a kind of neighborhood or at least regional connection to the school that you go to. And so we've seen this, of course, in Berkeley, which Brian rightly pointed out, 50 years ago in a different city with different demographics. So the comparisons are limited at best. We're seeing it actually being implemented as we speak in San Francisco Unified as they redesigned their enrollment policy, which, like Oakland, had reproduced and actually exacerbated neighborhood segregation, even though it was kind of totally the opposite of the plan. We also see it in Louisville or Jefferson County, Kentucky, which I think, even though that's a kind of metro and suburban joint district, it shows that this can be done across a large geographic area, which obviously Berkeley and San Francisco are both geographically much smaller than OUSD. And I'm seeing Kim Davis talking about transportation. That is something that I think would be very critical to revisit for this policy success. And it's one of the reasons that the challenge of providing transportation and the fact that OUSD currently doesn't, and the fact that it's kind of hard to see budgetarily and logistically how it would happen. That's why the feasibility of this plan is actually just okay. It's I don't think it's infeasible, but I think that it's not as easy to implement as either sticking with the status quo or maybe expanding the enrollment pilots. The desegregation effect, it's high on this. It would what we've seen from Berkeley is and from Louisville is that it really does radically change the segregation landscape. It really breaks up that concentrated poverty. As far as equitable choice, we rank this as good. Of course, it's no longer the complete unfettered choice that the status quo maintains, and so that's a fact. The choice is constrained, but it puts low-income families and affluent families on a similar footing, and we think that it provides also. We think that if the implementation were done correctly, that it could provide more quality school options for more kids, so that this choice that seems unfettered and complete right now, but it's like quite illusory for most low-income Black and Latinx families, would actually, the choices that would exist, although fewer, would be more palatable, more interesting, better for students. And yes, as I mentioned, the feasibility is kind of one of the bigger issues of this plan, but that kind of leads to my question that I have for you, Cassie, and you, Brian, as both kind of experts in the education space, as well as our USD parents. What structures or practices do you all see needing to exist to increase this plan's feasibility? I know Kim in the chat mentioned, or in the comments mentioned transportation, but I'd love to hear what, if anything, you all think might be done to increase a plan like this feasibility.
It's a big question. I mean, the question I think for me is, how do you structure it so that the families who have more means to make this feasible actually opt in to do it? Because I don't know that we're going to suddenly find the resources to create a like massive busing system. I think, yeah, I mean, I agree that transportation would eliminate one of the biggest barriers, but I do think there's like, for me, it comes back to the political will of families being willing, like recognizing that this is going to be disruptive, sometimes painful, like if you're having to leave a school that's especially if you're up in the hills and like that's a school that you have investment in, that's painful. And I think there has to be a way to structure it so that I think the only way it works is if we get the families who have the means and resources to be able to make this feasible are willing to do that. And like, I don't have a brilliant solution for how you create a policy around that. I think a lot of it does end up having to come back to building the buy-in and the willingness to make that change. And like, that is so hard. But I don't know how far we get without it. I don't know if that is a hopeful answer, but it's where I land on it.
I would say without transportation, that's really hard. I'd also wonder about getting some really good census analysis for USD to understand where kids are, because again, if you start from the I think you make that point. I think if OUSD's budget is 600 million, 700 million, not including all the facilities. And you in theory, that should be enough money. In reality, that's something is not working out right. The math isn't adding up. And so I do think you really do have to get down to maximizing the every dollar spend. And I do think in order for a system where you're going to be asking kids to go from Acorn Woodland neighborhood all the way up to the Northeast Hills, you're going to need a bus. Like you need something. And I'll be clear, in much of the rest of the country, they provide busing. So there is not there. We are not so special here in California and here in Oakland that there is not a potential solution here. It might require some state, it might require some federal, but it mostly will certainly require choices to be made about where we choose to prioritize our dollars. If we think that choice is important, I think it is, because I generally don't think you can try to tell people, I've given you choice for all this time and I'm going to take it back because it's more efficient for me. That's a political loser, and you won't make it real long with that strategy. So something around transportation, something around making sure that the zones are constructed such that you're where kids are and where they're going to be. Neighborhoods are changing in Oakland. People are delaying having children because it is expensive as hell to buy a house here. It's expensive as hell to rent here or go get groceries or what have you. And so I do think there's quite a bit of thought that can help you maybe design those a little narrower, that might alleviate some of the transpo needs. But ultimately, unless you could convince every person that getting any school in the yellow zone or the blue zone or the whatever color you want is more or less the same, then you're likely going to end up with the same problem. Or there'll be some schools that are like, oh my God, that's the school I go to. If I don't go, we're out. Or if you send me to this school, I'm out, right? And so that wouldn't solve that, because ultimately the quality issues, real and perceived, are what will most influence parental behavior. It influences mine. And I don't think I'm different than any other parent who's just trying to figure out how do I give my kid what they need so that way they have the best shot at building a thriving life. And I think every parent, regardless of your income, regardless of your race, longs for that deeply innate, um, deeply innate responsibility as a parent. So I think there's there, but I do think the feasibility on that one is very seems very challenging to figure out. I mean, honestly, for all of them, without some underlying root cause decisions that need to be made. And again, it's a question of our political will and our civic infrastructure if we can do that. I'm not sure. I don't think we have it right now. Quite a few things would likely need to change and evolve in our community for us to get there. And we haven't had it. We haven't really had it ever. I mean, we certainly haven't had it since the 60s or so. So I know that's not an optimistic answer, and I am.
Well, just by highlighting the potential of something being there gives me hope. So that's positive at least. But yeah, I would echo. I'm not sure who made the most recent comment, but it reiterates points that both Brian and Cassie made, and I think doing something like this in a pilot form. The image we showed was just a very rough idea to kind of mimic what Berkeley has, but obviously Oakland is larger, and overcoming some preconceived notions of schools could be a challenge for sure. But that is part of the disruptive nature of this, is the idea that schools that most often wrongfully are being overlooked, might be reconsidered when there's buy-in around what this policy lifts up in terms of values. So just to kind of close us off and show our very sophisticated algorithm here around how we would rank 3 of these policies, one being the status quo. It's a little hard to interpret, but we give a score based on just bad to great, 0 to 3, and in terms of if we are valuing desegregation as a means to increase the number of quality schools, to help stabilize enrollment, and providing a more equitable choice for families, and not kind of furthering this paradox of seeming to offer a lot of choice while providing little. We do think, and by we, as Reed and I have thought about this and researched it, do believe that has some serious potential when compared to other options, and don't want to pretend that there aren't other policy solutions to put forward. We could redraw attendance boundaries to try to make them more diverse, but that's limited because of neighborhood segregation. There are other options, but in terms of what other cities are trying, we did try to highlight some that are popular, if you will, in nature. So yeah, we're hoping that this could be a good takeaway for folks, and especially as the board and the Equitable Enrollment Working Group, which, for full transparency, I'm a part of, it begins to discuss this more and more. Any final thoughts from folks, or questions? I think we were doing a pretty good job answering ones we saw come in, but if there are any last ones in the next couple minutes, can definitely address them. All right. Well, if not, thank you all again so much for taking some of your Friday to participate in this discussion. I love the perspectives, and we do have one question that, I don't know if anyone wants to address. We can do so quickly before we sign off. I'm happy to take it as well.
I'll read it aloud and see what folks want to say. Have we talked to families, especially Black and Brown families and others farthest from opportunity, why they are choosing the schools that they do?
Yeah, just quickly, I can speak to that. There have been conversations, there have been surveys, there have been individual interviews. It's ongoing, and we need more of it. because we do definitely want to make sure that whenever we get to the point that a policy is being discussed, we hear from as representative segment of the community as possible. So definitely don't want to presume that we are proposing things that have X percentage of popular support. That will be a necessary part of any new policy exploration.
I will say, because I have been engaged in this kind of interview project, and so I have spoken with many Black and Brown families, and folks are choosing schools. Folks of all racial and socioeconomic backgrounds choose schools based on quality. Everyone wants a quality school for their kid. I think Brian said it. That's what he wants for his kids, and I think you're right, Brian. You're not unique in that as a parent. Parents, you're unique, but not in that way. We parents want a quality school for their kids, and so the families I've spoken with, a very large number of them are sending their kids either to charter schools or schools outside of their neighborhoods because they do not believe that the neighborhood school is of high enough quality to serve their kids. So quality above all, and I think that's why Kim had a really important framing of diversity and desegregation and integration. I think can add a lot of richness in folks' lived experiences, but more so than that, the point of this conversation is that we see desegregation as a means to increasing quality in schools, which is what families want above all else, and diversity maybe cherry on top.
The only thing I'd add, Reed, is it'd be really interesting to understand what information sources those families use. Oftentimes, both with my time at the Ed Fund and in my previous work in public education advocacy, there was always a frame of, we need to tell our story about how great this school is. And then you look at the scores and you look at the attendance and you're like, really? And so something is telling those families that I don't think they could be logging to OUSD data and pulling reports out of Tableau and analyzing it themselves. But I'm skeptical that they got time for that. And so something somewhere is there's something in their community that's telling them that. My nephew went there. It was that boy ain't learned nothing. I'm not sending my baby, but there's something that's happening. And so I think until you can better understand what those messages are, whether they're true or not is actually immaterial, because they are effective in their influence and decisions, and then figure out what else needs to be true. Then I think you end up spending a lot of money on really cool brochures and really nifty websites and marketing campaigns, which I would argue then if a parent goes there and it's a complete mess inside, then that all that does actually continue to burn up more trust. So there's something in there where you got to tell parents the truth about what's happening in the school with a level of commitment and conviction to saying, and here's what we're doing to get it better, and we need your help, or we need your partnership, or whatever it is. I think the other thing is I recall when they opened up La Escuelita and Met West, people were fired up because the building was new. Like, it was like, oh my God, that looks like the place people can learn, right? I think those schools are perfectly fine. But the point is, before anyone did anything, it was like, my baby going to that school because that school looks serious about it, right? So I do think that it's a really complex set of variables that they use and inputs that they use to make that decision, and it'd be really interesting to sort of dig in and figure out what that is, and then try to unpack that. And it's different. It's different for low-income families. It's different for me. I sit with the data with my kids. I'm like, this is what happens to Black boys in OUSD. So I need you to but that's me. I'm weird. So it will be really interesting to sort of see more research on that.
All right. Well, thank you all so much again. And yeah, this was great, and look forward to continuing the conversation with everyone as we hopefully move forward.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks all. Bye.
Thank you.